Welcome back to the channel, guys. It's the leader of the Cosmic Armada here, Wolf Nara here, and yeah, I know I'm late to the Lineage factor. Everyone talking about it with Sanji, so I'm gonna put my own spin on the Lineage factor. Today, we're gonna be talking about the Lineage factor in regards to the science behind it. So let's get started.
Who really a factor? I done grew up as a bastard, stepped out the womb into a disaster. Designing drugs and guns on my city after, pray for the lackers. Cause it only get worse and they try to blame it on the rappers, label us factors. My rappy told me sign an affidavit, like my life and my family ain't matter. Do you know how I feel to get served to the court on the platter? That shit happened. Lose your life as soon like the months in the womb that your mama went through never happened. Seeing another lady, your baby was killed every summer, that shit like a pattern.
So I am going to be using real world science to try to explain how Judge combined the lineage factor of a Lunarian or other species for the other siblings and humans together. So before we get started, we do have to lay some foundation with vocabulary, because when we are talking about biology, we're talking about a lot of different terminology people don't use. We're gonna make a foundation using vocabulary and thus explaining the theory after that, allowing the theory to pretty much be able to be understood easily. So first, let's explain the lineage factor. In chapter 840, the lineage factor was also referred to as the bloodline element in living things, or the blueprint of all life, by Yonji, who was explaining to Sanji about the cloning process for Germa soldiers. So now that we laid the foundation for what the lineage factor is, remember we are going to be using biology terms, and we're also going to be using terms from genetic engineering as well, so that way we can provide a proper explanation. The reason different species can't interbreed is due to the mechanism of reproductive isolation, such as pre and post zygotic. Now, pre-zygotic is a mechanism of reproductive isolation which prevents the egg from becoming fertile. So basically the sperm can hit the egg, however the sperm won't be able to attach itself to specific codes on the egg in which it allows itself to be put into. Then post-zygotic is pretty much different, in which the hybrid or the egg accepts the initial sperm, however it doesn't make it past the embryonic stage, in which it dies at the embryonic stage. So in the chart, the second row, first bar shows that in pre-zygotic nothing is fertile, while in post-zygotic it is fertile but it dies pretty much. So basically what stops two species from interbreeding is the egg cannot become fertile, or if it does become fertile and the sperm cells survive past that initial stage and enters the egg, it dies in the embryonic stage. Wow, I said embryonic, wow. Now we know in One Piece that Sanji's mother had to undergo genetic modification surgery. This is so she's able to survive the process of hybrids being created in her body, and also the baby to as well survive the process without being harmed. So she had to go under that genetic modification surgery. In the real world, typically stem cells could be used for the creation of a hybrid. Due to it being present in both human and animal, it can match up to 200 different type of cell types as well, allowing it to bond with different types of DNA easier. However, no such thing as this in One Piece, so we gonna have to rule that one out. Now remember, guys, we are still laying the groundwork and foundation, so before we can build a nice strong building, we have to have a nice strong foundation. So let's continue on and start talking about RNA and DNA. So first we're going to talk about DNA, because it's a lot more simple to explain. DNA is the building blocks of life itself. It provides the storing and transferring of information towards one species offspring. It has a sugar base known as deoxyribose, and the acids or the amino acids are adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Next is RNA. It's a little bit more complicated, but let's start with the basics. Unlike DNA double helix, it's a single strand. The base is sugar, but it's called ribose. The amino acids are adenine, uracil, guanine, and cytosine. So it pretty much has the exact same amino acids besides uracil, and that's pretty much the difference between RNA and DNA. Now we're going to get into more of the process and the 3 different types of RNA, because those are really important. The first is the messenger RNA. When the DNA instructs for a certain protein to be made, the messenger RNA gets that message. It then transfer it to the ribosome. And so the ribosome, you can think of the ribosome as a protein factory. So once the RNA gets to the ribosome, it enters the ribosome, in which it actually becomes the second type of RNA, which is ribosomal RNA. Just basically saying that they used the message from the DNA and it's then put it to the RNA or the protein factory, so that way the DNA can get the protein it needs to make the specific phenotype for the organism. Then we have the third type, which is transfer RNA. Sometimes the RNA actually has to attach to the ribosome, in which it uses the adenine, uracil, guanine, and cytosine as pairs or keys to unlock the ribosome, so that protein can be made through that combination of amino acids. Next, we're going to be talking about genetic manipulation, and specifically RNA splicing. So with RNA splicing, you take the non-coding sequence of the genes called the introns. This then transforms the RNA strand into what is called a mature RNA, which allows the single RNA strand to produce the necessary protein, or, my apologies, let me reiterate, it allows the single strand of RNA to be ready to send a message to produce the necessary proteins, thus skipping the first couple of initial stages of it leaving the cell. Sometimes these proteins, in this case, would be manipulated instead of the base pairs going together. Let's say they would pretty much, instead of A and T being paired together, they would have U and T being paired together, thus allowing a different type of phenotype to occur within that specific organism. This would also explain why when Judge is doing the cloning process, some of the clones look different than the other clones. However, they have the initial same face model, but their physiques are different. Now that we got this far, essentially Judge produced a surgery that takes a piece of the DNA of another species, in which he uses that DNA to send messages via RNA to produce specific proteins that produce specific phenotypes or characteristics of per se species DNA he used to splice. Now, we do need to explain genome and phenotype. So, genome is pretty much the cells that's required, or genes that's required to make a specific phenotype or a specific characteristic or physical characteristic. So, for example, you may have a pair of amino acids that says AUTT, and that gives you black hair. But then you may have one that says UUGT, and that gives you Sanji's curly eyebrows. So what it seems is that Judge was taking the weaker elements of the human DNA and mixing that with other species, but kept the genes intact to make sure the phenotype resulted in a humanoid physical appearance, while still being able to use the abilities of the other species. One thing that was really important to Judge was that he wanted to completely make his children soldiers that was completely rid of emotion. So let's see if we can use science to explain this as well. There are a couple of different things that could be used to affect emotion in the human body, but today we're going to just mostly focus on dopamine and the limbic system. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and the nervous system uses it to send messages between nerve cells. Think of it as a chemical mail deliverer. It's responsible for processing pain, telling your body how you feel, hence your mood, telling your body when to sleep, etc. So it also controls the way you experience phenomena. Typically happiness, as stated before, comes from dopamine being sent out from your brain at a higher dosage. That's how you can experience happiness, and you can tell the difference from this feeling to this feeling of happiness because of the levels of dopamine rises that's pretty much secreted throughout the brain. Now, continuing on to the limbic system, this system is responsible for behavioral and emotional responses. It is located under the cerebral cortex and located above the brainstem. Now, the limbic system is comprised of a few different parts, and so I will explain how Judge possibly either turned off some of the functions or adjusted some of the functions to suit the needs of his emotionless soldiers. First, the hippocampus, which controls the filing of memory and the spread of that memory across the cerebral cortex, which means that the Germa siblings must have an enlarged hippocampus compared to normal humans, due to the fact that the Germa twins was learning a lot of advanced mathematics and science and battle tactics at a younger age, in which they was able to learn that and put it to use at a quicker rate than a normal human would. Next is the amygdala. This attaches emotion to memories. It also influences the body automatic fear response. Judge could have adjusted the amygdala to where there is no emotional attachment to memory, but they're still able to recall information, as seen with Yonji providing Sanji information on the fluid used for the clones. So now, as a side note, we're going to talk about the fluid for the clones. It has nothing to do with anything. It's just a fun fact about One Piece. Now, in chapter 840, Yonji called the liquid that the clones were sitting in biocultural liquid, which is beneficial microbes, which also acts as an antioxidant that produces the environment for plants to grow. So essentially, that fluid is what allows Germa to create 20-year-old clones within the span of 5 years. Last, you have the cingulate gyrus part of the limbic system that is responsible for processing behavior regulation and automatic motor functions. So like walking and running and things that you typically don't think about doing, but it happens automatically. Judge must have adjusted these senses where their automatic motor functions are there to set specifically to save Judge and keep him alive. Now, we're going to talk about King and his title, specifically of wildfire. In typical media, great blazes or wildfire are symbolic with anger or hatred. As we know that he is the last of his race was completely wiped off the face of One Piece. It was wiped off the face of the map, which could result in a deep-seated hatred for King, which also that emotion could manifest into King's fire, also giving him the epithet of being a wildfire. So basically, his fire is controlled by his emotions. Now that we laid the foundation, we're going to discuss Sanji Lunarian factors and how it pretty much factor into his power, but also differs from his siblings, in which I would like to personally shout out Townsend, you feel me? Townsend the GOAT, you feel me? He said Niji factor or genetic factor is from the minks, is why he's able to produce electricity. And hey, I was never thinking about that. That was fire, so I had to give bro a quick shout out. So now let's get into the Sanji science. We know that with his mother, Sora vINSMOKE, that she had to go through that genetic modification surgery, in which I personally believe it allowed her egg to accept the DNA of other species, allow the RNA to actually be able to produce, and have the body produce the necessary proteins that creates the genomes, that creates the phenotypes, that creates the vINSMOKE siblings. So essentially, Judge got a portion of. So essentially, Judge got in a piece of the DNA from a Lunarian, in which he already had his wife go through that surgery. So the DNA was able to be accepted by her egg, and so it skipped past the pre and post-zygotic, which pretty much prevents different organisms from interbreeding. And so with that, this then allowed the DNA to begin to send different proteins, as stated before, specifically set for the Lunarians, so that way some of their traits could be a little bit more dominant in regards to them being able to utilize their ability within Sanji. And so with that protein being made, that's why Sanji's actually able to convert his legs, which he's probably able to convert different parts of his body given the science, but he's able to convert his legs specific ability of the Lunarian. in of itself. And so because he has the proteins or the DNA of a Lunarian, the proteins itself of a Lunarian is going to pretty much provide him with the genetic trait to produce that fire. Sanji constantly says his emotions are causing his legs to ignite, which is only halfway true. If King Power of Fire is connected to his emotions, then the way Judge warned emotionless children / soldiers will kind of intervene with the way that the Lunarian powers function, thus making Sanji at the time seem like a normal human compared to his sibling. Since the other species that his brothers and sisters are connected to or spliced with genetically don't need their emotions to produce their powers, they was able to use it even though their powers were shut off or their emotions were shut off. So when Sora vINSMOKE took the medicine, it only affected Sanji's limbic system and his dopamine released through the brain. Beyond that, he's that of a normal human genetically. And so now Sanji's dopamine levels are extremely high in regards to women. This is why he always overreacts and has excessive nosebleeds, because dopamine is pretty much where you get your happiness from, and so he experiences true happiness when he's around women. Typically this makes Sanji, I don't want to say Sanji is at his strongest, but he's more motivated to fight harder when it comes to the sake of women. So now specifically the type of dopamine that is released is D1 dopamine, which is pretty much released in case of addiction. So like when you're addicted to like a certain substance, dopamine or D1 dopamine specifically is released through the brain, in which that's why you feel a sense of relaxation when you're pretty much dealing with substance abuse. Now in regards to Sanji's limbic system, his hippocampus is not as enlarged as his brothers or his sister or pretty much his siblings, just due to the fact that he wasn't really able to pick up on everything as quickly as others. When Zeph was teaching him how to cook, he was still pretty much making simple mistakes during the cooking process, even though Zeph showed him initially. So he still had pretty much the learning curve of a human, or at least to a lesser extent than his brothers and sisters. So it took him a lot longer to learn something that his brothers and sisters would learn quicker. Now Sanji's amygdala is enhanced compared to that of a normal human and his siblings, because he's able to attach his emotions to past traumas that causes him to burst into flame, which is the explanation for his technique called Hell's Memories. Now with Sanji's singular gyrus is more stimulated than typical humans. Sanji is able to process such emotions at an increased rate. Typically, the singular gyrus, you're able to process emotion 200 times faster than you're able to actually think. So that's why when someone says something to you, you immediately has an emotional reaction to it, or feel some type of emotional connection to that situation. Now, for example, when saving the Germa family, it was an intense moment for Sanji, in which it was the first time he was shown to be dominant in front of his family. Ironically, this emotion manifested because of the emotional connection being intensified because of the feeling to want to save his family. And this, ironically, is one of the few times where we actually get a panel or a still shot showing both of Sanji's leg on fire in Diablo Jambbe. Another instance where his emotions was intensified was actually when he was training on Kama Island. He was in distress constantly, so he made running away almost an autonomous movement, which is then his body began to run even faster by kicking the ground about 12 times, and which is how he learned Skywalk without actually purposely training for Skywalk. Since we just explained not only how Sanji and the Germa twins, well specifically Sanji, is spliced with Lunarians and how his emotions affect his power, now let's talk about the science behind Diablo Jambbe and how those emotions produce flames. So if the evidence of the Lunarians' emotions, as stated before, being connected to their flames, is correct, then it should be able to be explained biologically. So when feeling the rush of emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, dopamine is sent to the nerves, which responds to ignite the cells in the body. For Sanji, it's the blood in his, well, that is pretty much his blood cells that ignite into flames, in which, since he fights for his legs, those blood cells that ignite are in his feet and legs, pretty much like from his calf muscles on downward. The pores of the skin begins to open, which allows the heat to escape from the body. But humans has a melting point in which the body changes from a solid to a liquid. For example, when ice pretty much goes from ice back to water, it has a specific amount of heat it can take before it begins to melt. This would affect Sanji because he is a human. However, Sanji does have an exoskeleton. His body is stated to be a lot more durable than others, so that plays a factor on him not being able to melt, because the exoskeleton melting point is pretty much higher than that of a normal human. So although he does initiate and activate Diablo Jambbe, the melting point of his skin and even his leg hairs too is a lot higher due to the exoskeleton. So now his power doesn't backfire and pretty much hurts him. And so the Germa's suit, now we did get in chapter 1023 that Sanji said that he was feeling weird after putting the German suit on. And so it also got me thinking in regards to that. This means, for example, like the German suits are specifically designed to only activate for the siblings. And so when Sanji suit activates, it's literally only activate for him, which means it may be tied to his DNA. And so if the suit pretty much intensifies the way the German sibling uses their powers, this essentially, it pretty much modified their DNA to be closer to that other species they're being spliced with. So when Sanji put the ray seal on, his DNA should be closer to that of a Lunarian. When Niji does it, it should be that closer to that of a mink. Not saying that he gets the powers to go so long, but more of that his ability to command electro gets stronger, because genetically he's becoming more minkish, but he doesn't get the dominant trait of becoming Sulong. He just gets more of the recessive trait. But anyway, let me know what you guys think of this video. I don't even know what to call this video. Maybe I call it the science behind Germa, the best Sanji video you've ever seen. But anyway, feel free to tell a friend, you feel me, to pull up again, like, comment, and subscribe to your boy. It's been your boy Wolf Nara, leader of the Cosmic Armada. I'm out.
They know why I'm pulling up L's, as long as I'm a lot of